Ever imagine yourself fleeing England, like escaping to the continent, because you're just too scandalous for London society?
Hmm.
That's Lord Byron in the early 1800s. Celebrity poet, living a life filled with, well, romantic escapades, defying every societal norm.
That's familiar.
Right. You sent us an episode of The Rest is History.
Oh, great episode.
It dives into the latter half of Byron's life after that self-imposed exile. And I have to say, fascinating stuff. So let's unpack what made Byron tick, why his poetry still resonates today, and explore those dramatic years he spent abroad.
What's captivating about Byron, I think, is that his life constantly intersected with major historical events, influential literary movements. He wasn't some poet scribbling away in isolation, you know. He was right at the center of it all, shaping and being shaped by the world around him.
And that world, in the years after he leaves England, it gets pretty interesting. He ends up in Switzerland. And this is where the story takes a turn towards the, well, Gothic. He meets Percy Shelley, Mary Godwin, who of course becomes Mary Shelley, and Claire Clairmont. It's like a who's who of future literary giants, all gathered in one place.
Almost too perfect a setup, isn't it?
It is.
And the historical context makes it even more dramatic. 1816, the year without a summer, caused by a massive volcanic eruption in Indonesia.
Wow.
Imagine gloomy skies, constant rain, this pervasive sense of unease.
I can only imagine.
It's no wonder they turned to writing ghost stories, right?
Ah, yes. The famous ghost story competition. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein emerges from that. But Byron also writes a vampire tale.
That story, later published as The Vampire, features an aristocratic vampire. Quite a departure from the traditional folklore. You know, vampires as more peasant-like creatures.
Right.
Byron's portrayal shifted the whole perception of the vampire, adding a layer of sophistication and, dare I say, sex appeal to these creatures of the night. It plays into his own mystique and fascination with the dark side of human nature.
And speaking of darkness, there's his poem, The Giaour. With that chilling curse about someone doomed to destroy those they love, it almost feels like foreshadowing, considering the rumors surrounding his personal life.
Absolutely. The poem fueled the speculation around Byron at the time. His estranged wife, Lady Byron, even claimed he believed he was cursed to harm those closest to him.
Oh, wow.
Whether that was true or just part of the, mad, bad, and dangerous to know image he cultivated is still debated.
So, already carrying this dark reputation, he moves to Venice. What was it about that city that drew him in?
Venice in the early 1800s, well, it was a fascinating mirror to Byron's own duality. A city of faded grandeur under Austrian rule, struggling to maintain its independence. Yet it was also a place of immense beauty, intrigue, and a certain, shall we say, decadence that appealed to Byron's sensibilities.
And he certainly didn't shy away from that decadent lifestyle, did he?
Yeah.
His letters from this period are full of details about his extravagant parties, late-night escapades, and numerous romantic conquests.
Those letters weren't just gossip fodder, though. Brilliantly written, full of sharp observations about Venetian society. And, by extension, the state of Europe after the Napoleonic Wars. He was crafting an image of the glamorous expat life, one that still resonates today.
But he wasn't just living it up, he was also writing. This is when he starts working on Don Juan, his epic, satirical poem. What's so special about this work?
Don Juan is considered a masterpiece of satire, full of Byron's trademark wit and biting social commentary. He takes aim at English society, and his estranged wife, Lady Byron, is definitely not spared from his pen.
Oh.
He calls her Donna Inez in the poem, and there's this line that really sums up his feelings towards her. But oh, ye lords of ladies intellectual, inform us truly, have they not henpecked you all?
Ouch. Clearly there were some unresolved issues there.
To say the least, Don Juan is full of these little jabs, but it also explores broader themes: hypocrisy, social injustice, and the absurdity of human behavior. It's a complex work, layered with irony and wordplay, that continues to fascinate and provoke readers today.
So we have scandal, exile, Gothic tales, satirical poetry. It's a lot to take in. Where does Byron's life go from here?
Surprisingly, towards love and a period of relative stability, at least for Byron. He meets Countess Teresa Guiccioli and embarks on a passionate affair. She was much younger than him and already married, so the relationship was obviously unconventional for the time.
Stable and Byron seem like contradictory terms. How did that even work?
It seems Teresa had a calming influence on him. Despite the unconventional nature of their relationship, she provided a sense of normalcy and domesticity that Byron hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't without its challenges, of course, but it was a significant chapter in his life.
However, this period wasn't without tragedy either. Byron's illegitimate daughter, Allegra, dies while living in a convent.
Yes. Allegra's death at the young age of 5 was a devastating blow to Byron. He had insisted she be raised Catholic and placed in a convent. But losing a child, regardless of the circumstances, is a profound and heartbreaking experience. It's hard to know the full extent of his grief, as he was very private about his emotions, but it's clear that her death had a lasting impact on him.
So we see this softer side of Byron emerging, but at the same time, his political awareness is reignited by events like the Peterloo Massacre in England and his involvement with Italian revolutionaries. It's like these two sides of him, the romantic and the revolutionary, are constantly vying for dominance.
It's a fascinating dynamic. The Peterloo Massacre, for those who might not be familiar, was a horrific event where British troops attacked a peaceful demonstration for parliamentary reform in Manchester. It shocked the nation and galvanized many, including Byron, to speak out against the government's oppressive tactics. His involvement with Italian revolutionaries further shows his growing disillusionment with the political climate of Europe. He wasn't just observing from afar anymore, he was actively engaging in the fight for freedom and justice.
It's interesting to compare his political evolution with that of Percy Shelley. They were close friends, but had very different approaches to these issues.
Absolutely. Shelley was an idealist, a true believer in the power of revolution to create a utopian society. Byron, while sympathetic to the cause of freedom, was more cynical, perhaps jaded by his own experiences. He believed in the fight, but he was also aware of its complexities and the potential for things to go wrong.
And then tragedy strikes again. With Shelley's drowning, off the coast of Italy, what impact did this have on Byron?
Shelley's death in 1822 was a devastating loss for Byron, both personally and creatively. They had challenged and inspired each other, and their friendship was a defining element of Byron's time in Italy. He was present when Shelley's body washed ashore, and even participated in the cremation on the beach. There's a rather macabre detail about him wanting to keep Shelley's skull, though ultimately it was buried with the rest of his remains.
Wow. That's a bit intense. Even for Byron, it sounds like Shelley's death marked the end of a significant chapter in his life. What happens next? Where does he go from here?
Well, after Shelley's death, Byron moves to Pisa with Teresa and her family, the Gambas. The Gambas were deeply involved in Italian revolutionary politics, and Byron gets caught up in their world, even participating in some minor uprisings.
So that rebellious streak never really left him, did it?
Not at all. He's also still writing during this time, and this is when Don Juan really starts to take shape. He becomes increasingly critical of English society, even mocking King George III in a satirical piece after the king's death.
I can't imagine that went over well back in England.
It most certainly did not. His reputation in England becomes even more scandalous. But it also adds to his mystique. He's viewed as this dangerous, brilliant, and utterly unpredictable figure.
But it seems like through all of this, the parties, the romances, the political intrigue, there's still this sense that he's longing for something more, something beyond writing and fleeting pleasures.
I think that's at the heart of Byron's character, a constant yearning for something more, something to give his life meaning beyond personal fulfillment or literary fame. And that's what ultimately leads him to Greece.
Greece. Okay, so this is where things get really interesting. Let's talk about his journey there and what draws him to this particular cause.
At the time, Greece was in the midst of a war for independence from the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
The struggle for freedom resonated deeply with Byron's own beliefs, his experience of feeling like an outsider, fighting against societal constraints.
Because he essentially drops everything and set sail for Greece to join the fight.
He does. Byron throws himself into the Greek cause. And not just with words. He uses his fame, his fortune to raise funds, awareness for the revolution.
Wow.
He even effectively bankrolls a significant portion of the Greek war effort, equipping ships, supporting troops.
Talk about putting your money where your mouth is.
Exactly. It's a testament to his commitment. He arrives in Missolonghi, a strategically important city in western Greece, and his presence met with jubilation. The Greeks see him as a symbol of hope, a powerful ally in their fight for independence. But the reality of war proves much harsher than Byron might have anticipated.
So it's not all heroic poses and grand speeches.
Not at all. Byron faces illness, harsh conditions, and is disillusioned by the infighting among the various Greek factions, He quickly realizes that revolution is messy, complex, and often far from the romantic ideal he might have envisioned.
And this is all happening just a few years after Shelley's death. It seems like a period of immense upheaval and change for Byron.
It certainly was. And remember, he's still grappling with the loss of his daughter, Allegra, and dealing with the fallout from his scandalous reputation. Back in England, he's carrying a lot of personal baggage, along with his revolutionary zeal.
Okay, before we get to his final days in Greece, I want to rewind a bit. What happens between Shelley's death and his arrival in Missolonghi? You mentioned he was in Pisa with Teresa and her family.
Right. So after Shelley's death, the Shelleys, Mary and Claire, along with the Hunts, Leigh Hunt and his family, decided to return to England. Byron decided to stay on with Teresa and her family in Italy. As I mentioned, the Gambas were heavily involved in Italian revolutionary politics, and this rubbed off on Byron. He participated in some minor uprisings, but he was also writing prolifically during this period. This is when Don Juan really starts to take shape. He becomes increasingly critical of English society, even mocking King George III in a satirical piece after the king's death.
Which probably didn't help his already tarnished reputation back home.
Not at all. He was increasingly viewed as a dangerous radical by the English establishment, but that only seemed to fuel his rebellious spirit.
And yet, through all of this, there's still that yearning for something more, that sense that he hasn't quite found his true purpose.
That's a very astute observation. I think Byron was always searching for a way to translate his ideals into action. He wanted to make a difference, to leave a lasting mark on the world. And he saw the Greeks' struggle for independence as his opportunity to do just that.
So back to Greece and those final days. Paint us a picture of what happens.
Byron arrives in Missolonghi to a hero's welcome, but the situation is far from ideal. The city is under siege, resources are scarce, and the weather is miserable. Byron throws himself into the struggle, organizing troops, securing funds, and trying to unify the often fractious Greek leaders. He even adopts a young Turkish orphan and considers claiming him as his heir.
But his health deteriorates.
Yes. He catches a fever, probably malaria, and his condition worsens rapidly. On his 36th birthday, he writes a poem reflecting on his life, his lost loves, and his fading youth. It's a poignant piece, full of a sense of resignation and an awareness of his own mortality.
Here's where things get even more fascinating. Byron could have left Missolonghi, sought better medical care, but he refused. He felt this immense sense of duty to the Greek cause. There's a quote attributed to him: "I would rather die doing something than nothing."
It's a powerful statement that speaks volumes about his transformation. This is no longer the self-absorbed young lord seeking pleasure and fame. He's found a cause greater than himself and is willing to sacrifice everything for it.
It's a dramatic shift from the Byron we saw even just a few years earlier. What were those last days like for him?
He was bedridden, often delirious, with fever, but even in his weakened state, he continued to write and strategize. There are accounts of him muttering the names of loved ones: Augusta, his half-sister, Ada, his daughter, and Hobhouse, his loyal friend.
No mention of Lady Byron.
None that I've come across. It seems their tumultuous relationship and her subsequent campaign to discredit him truly marked the end of that chapter in his life.
So how does it all end? The Rest is History episode mentions a dramatic ending.
On April 19th, 1824, as a thunderstorm raged outside, Byron lay on his deathbed. Just as the sun was setting, he opened his eyes one last time, and then, peacefully, passed away. The timing, the setting, the circumstances, it all felt almost Shakespearean.
What a way to go out. What was the reaction to his death? He was a celebrity, even a controversial one, so I imagine made quite a splash.
His death sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Newspapers were filled with tributes, obituaries lamenting the loss of a literary giant and a champion of liberty. The Greeks mourned him as a national hero, and his death further galvanized support for their cause.
It's remarkable how his life, even in death, continued to generate such strong reactions. What happened next? Was his body brought back to England?
Yes, his body was returned to England. But there's a bit of irony in what happened next. Westminster Abbey, where many of England's most famous figures are buried, refused to bury him in Poets' Corner due to his scandalous reputation.
Can you imagine the headlines if Twitter existed back then? It would have been a frenzy.
Absolutely. But speaking of things disappearing, there's a mystery surrounding Byron's memoirs. I recall reading that they were destroyed. What's the story there?
Ah, yes, the infamous lost memoirs. Fill us in on what happened.
So before leaving for Greece, Byron gave his memoirs to his friend, the poet Thomas Moore, with instructions to publish them after his death.
Seems straightforward enough. What could go wrong?
Well, after Byron's death, his friends and family gathered to discuss his memoirs. They were very concerned about the potentially damaging revelations. You see, They might contain, particularly those regarding Byron's relationship with his half-sister Augusta.
Ah, yes, that infamous rumor. It's like a real-life Gothic novel unfolding.
Exactly. They were also worried about protecting the reputations of others who might be mentioned in the memoirs. Ultimately, they made the controversial decision to burn them.
Wow. Talk about a historical cover-up. What a loss for biographers and curious minds like us.
It's a decision that's been debated for centuries. Some argue it was an act of censorship, designed to protect Byron's image, while others believe it was necessary to prevent further scandal and heartache.
It's fascinating to think what those memoirs might have revealed. But even without them, Byron's life and work have captivated people for generations. So let's shift gears and talk about his legacy. What happened to the other key players in his story after his death?
Well, Augusta continued to struggle financially, and she died deeply in debt. Lady Byron, on the other hand, became a prominent social reformer, dedicating herself to causes like prison reform and education. However, she also lived under the shadow of Byron's accusations, forever linked to their scandalous separation.
It's amazing how even after his death, Byron continued to influence the lives of those around him. But what about Ada Lovelace? She's become quite a prominent figure in recent years, often celebrated as a pioneer in computer science.
Ada, Byron's legitimate daughter, inherited her father's brilliance and independent spirit. She excelled in mathematics and is credited with writing the first algorithm intended to be processed by a machine, winning her the title of the first computer programmer.
That's incredible. It's like a direct link from the Romantic era to the digital age.
Yeah.
But sadly, like her father, Ada also died young.
Yes, she died at the age of 36, the same age as Byron. After struggling with gambling debts and poor health, it's a tragic echo of her father's life. A life filled with so much potential, cut short too soon.
So we have Byron dying a hero in Greece, his friends and family grappling with his legacy back in England, and his daughter making history in a field that wouldn't even exist for another century. It really highlights the ripple effect of one person's life. But let's talk about Byron's lasting impact on literature and culture. He's considered one of the greatest romantic poets, but why? What set him apart?
Byron's poetry truly captured the spirit of the Romantic era, which emphasized emotion, individualism, and rebellion against societal norms. He poured his own personal experiences, his loves, losses, triumphs, and yes, scandals into his work, creating a voice that was both deeply personal and universally relatable.
He wasn't afraid to be vulnerable, to explore the darker aspects of human nature, and he did it with incredible wit and style.
Precisely. His poetry was daring, unconventional, and often shocking to his contemporaries. He tackled themes of love, death, freedom, and exile with a rawness and honesty that resonated with readers. His famous work, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, is a perfect example. It's full of longing for something more, a sense of restlessness and disillusionment that I think many people can relate to, even today.
That's so true. Even centuries later, we still grapple with those same questions of identity, belonging, and searching for meaning in a world that often feels chaotic and unfulfilling.
Exactly. Byron gave voice to that feeling of being an outsider, of yearning for something beyond the confines of societal expectations. He celebrated the individual, the rebel, the person who dared to live life on their own terms. And that's a message that continues to resonate.
I love that. It's both inspiring and a little bit dangerous, just like Byron himself. But before we get too carried away by the romance of it all, we need to address the elephant in the room. Or rather, the accusations that have followed him for centuries. The rumors of incest, the broken hearts, the defiance of social norms. These weren't just quirks, they were serious transgressions.
You're right. We can't talk about Byron without acknowledging the darker aspects of his character and the very real harm his actions may have caused. It's a complex issue, and one that requires nuance and careful consideration.
So how do we reconcile the brilliant poet, the champion of freedom, with the man accused of such serious offenses?
It's not about condoning or excusing harmful behavior. It's about recognizing that people are complicated, capable of both great acts of love and generosity, and terrible mistakes. Byron's life was a constant push and pull between his idealism and his darker impulses.
And that complexity is part of what makes him so fascinating. He wasn't a saint or a monster, but a human being, struggling with his own flaws and trying to make sense of the world around him.
Precisely. We can learn from Byron's mistakes, just as we can be inspired by his triumphs. He was a product of his time, but he also helped to shape his time, and his influence continues to ripple through literature, art, and culture, prompting us to question, to challenge, and to embrace the full spectrum of human experience.
Makes you wonder what Byron would make of the world today. With social media, everyone can be famous for 15 minutes, and everyone has a platform to express their opinions, for better or worse. Would he be a Twitter warrior, an influencer, a controversial blogger?
It's a fascinating thought experiment. Part of me thinks he would have thrived in our current media landscape. He was a master of self-promotion, always aware of his public image, even as he cultivated an image of rebellion.
He'd probably have millions of followers constantly stirring up controversy. With his witty tweets and scandalous Instagram posts, maybe he'd even start his own social media platform, dedicated to free speech and challenging societal norms.
That's a very Byronic image, but I also think he'd be disillusioned by the shallowness and fleeting nature of online fame. Remember, he was a man who craved something deeper, something with a lasting impact. Perhaps he would have become a recluse, retreating from the digital world to focus on his writing, only emerging occasionally to drop a bombshell essay or poem. That would set the internet on fire.
That's an intriguing idea, the solitary genius, brooding in his villa, crafting works that challenge the status quo and expose the hypocrisies of the world.
It's certainly a fitting image for the man who once said, "There is a pleasure in the pathless woods. There is a rapture on the lonely shore. There is society where none intrudes. By the deep sea and music in its roar, I love not man the less, but nature more."
What a beautiful quote. It speaks to that yearning for solitude, for connection with nature, and for a deeper understanding of the world around us. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Lord Byron's life and legacy, what's the key takeaway for our listener? What's the one thing you hope they'll remember?
I think the most important thing to remember is that Byron's story, for all its drama and complexity, is ultimately a story about the human condition. He was a man of contradictions, brilliant and flawed, passionate and cynical, driven by both noble ideals and self-destructive impulses. But in his struggles and triumphs, we see reflections of our own desires, our own search for meaning and purpose.
He reminds us that life isn't about achieving perfection, but about embracing the journey, with all its messiness and uncertainty. It's about having the courage to be ourselves, even when that means going against the grain.
That's a perfect way to put it. And who knows, maybe exploring Byron's life will inspire you to tap into your own creative side, to speak truth to power, or even just to live a little more boldly.
Well said. This deep dive has only scratched the surface of Byron's fascinating life and legacy. If you're intrigued, I encourage you to explore his poetry, his letters, and the many biographies written about him. You might be surprised by what you discover about yourself along the way. And don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more explorations of intriguing topics. Until next time.